arrested, the police department arrested both of them the next week. So anyway, it is what it is.
Hey, Razik.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time.
Seeing you. Hi, Joe.
Yep.
I have 6:30 now. I'm going to start the
Okay.
and we are already recording.
Do we want to wait a few more minutes to see if there are other
I'd say let's give it
attendees?
a couple more minutes. Yeah. So Razik, I think you'd probably like me to spell your name correctly, right? I must put a typo when we put it in.
Indeed, I appreciate it. Thank you.
And I'm guessing you shared your link with somebody.
Yeah, I'm going to share it now. Oh, I can't.
No, I mean, you shared your link for this meeting.
No.
He's on two devices.
Yeah, I'm trying. So to the extent that I have a presentation, if I'm able to share my screen.
Yes, you will be able to once we start the meeting and your item is called. I could give you permission to do that.
Yep, that's just me. That's me also on my phone as well.
Oh, okay.
Because once I share my screen, I won't be able to see what I'm looking at.
Oh, you just taught me to do something.
How is everyone doing this evening?
Well,
Thank
So,
you. I thought it was everyone's spokesperson. Jeff.
Jeremy, there's a new co-chair.
Yes, Diana Gonzalez.
She's not here.
Not yet.
Okay. All right.
We only have a couple of board members so far. We have a couple of attendees too. Four.
So Razik, you're going to be making the National Grid presentation?
Yeah, so I'm going to be making a very condensed version of a much longer presentation. If you guys would like me to come back with, some engineers and things of that nature who can speak to the specifics of some of the things I'm going to present.
I actually read the report earlier today, so it's publicly available.
Yes, indeed. And so, yeah, so basically, relative to the scoping plan, the state has mandated that we all transition to a clean energy future. To that point, National Grid has responded with our plan to reach those goals. With that being said,
maybe you want to hold that until you for the beginning of when you start your presentation, so you don't have to repeat yourself. So
indeed. But yeah, I was saying, but to the larger point, if you guys wanted me to come back with some of our engineers and things of that nature to flush out any aspect of this presentation, I'm more than happy to do so.
Thank you. Joe Sarah Evans is also our other presenter.
from Greenwood.
Yes.
Yep.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Is that from somewhere in Greenwood Cemetery?
That is, yeah.
Which building is it?
It's at the service yard, so it's the
I
little.
walk through there all the time. That's
Yeah.
34th Street.
That's right. Yeah.
Most importantly, this time of year, above ground.
That'd be cool if we had an underground office, though. That'd be really cool.
Well, still working across the street. Can dig down.
It's true.
All right. Why don't we start with the meeting, Jeremy, with roll call? So.
Okay, great. So I am going to mute everyone. Committee members. Not everyone, obviously. Committee members, when I call your name, please unmute yourself, acknowledge your name, and then mute yourself again. Excuse me one moment. Calvin. Hopefully that worked. Okay, let's start with Joe Canale.
Here.
Thank you. Diana Gonzalez. Amel Afzal. Nicholas Azadian. Joan Body.
Here.
Thank you. Christina Das. Mary Jo Eister. Nicole Huang. Nicole Huang. I see Nicole, but she's not unmuting herself. Paul Mack. John Johnston. John Johnston. I see John's name as well. We could get back to him as well. Arelis Martinez. Marilyn Melman. Gabino Morales. Dan Murphy. Dr. Carmen Rivera. Samuel Sierra.
Year over year. The seventh.
Hi, good evening, President.
Thank you. Fred Wolf. Let's get back to Nicole Huang. I see she's left. Perhaps she's signing back in. Yep, we'll get back to her in a second. John Johnston. John Johnston. Nicole Huang.
Yes, here.
Gotcha. Thank you. Roll has been called. I have not marked John present yet.
Okay. I also heard from Mary Jo Eister. She's having trouble with the link, so.
I see her in as an attendee. I'm going to make her, and she raised her hand to let us know, to promote her to panelist, so she should be joining us in a moment.
Okay, so we have two presentations this evening, one by National Grid and the other by Greenwood Cemetery. The first presentation is, I think we're going to hear how National Grid is going to meet the emissions goals established by New York State's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which was passed in July of 2019. And Sarah will tell us about, I think, the rain gardens that were funded through a DEC grant to Greenwood Cemetery. So,
Oh, no, not that one. I'm actually
not that
speaking.
one?
Yeah, no, I'm actually speaking on a tree planting project
Oh,
that was
okay.
funded by, the New York State DEC.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
All right.
The stormwater
Okay.
initiative will come now.
Oh, okay. All right. So Razik, you can start with your presentation.
Thank you. Just give me a moment to share my screen here.
Also, I would remind people, please refrain from asking questions or making comments until after the presentations have been made.
Sorry, I got kicked out there. It's not allowing me to share my screen currently, Jeremy.
Make you a co-host again. And you should be able to now.
Wonderful.
We can see it.
You all see the presentation?
Yes.
Wonderful. Apologies for those brief technical issues. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for allowing me the time to present. My name is Razik Seabrook, and I am the Borough of Brooklyn Manager for Customer and Community Affairs for National Grid. This evening, I'll be giving you guys a very brief presentation of a much larger document that, as was explained, is a National Grid's response to ensure that we are meeting our emission goals as outlined by the CLCPA. Before I get started, I would like you guys to know a few things as it relates to the presentation. If you take nothing else away from this presentation, I'm really wanting to highlight 3 components of it, namely affordability, reliability, and feasibility as it relates to the presentation. If you have questions, Jeremy, I'm indifferent to whether you all would like to ask questions in real time or at the end. But per this direction, I'm open to, you all asking questions at the end. So with that being said, we'd like to get started. So let's here at slide 1. See how this just outlines the goals of the CPA and some of the mandates. 40% of emissions by 2030, 80% by 2050. These are relative to some goals that were set, some targets that were set in 1990. In December of this year, the CAC has released their draft scoping plan, which is their tentative pathway in which they assume that the state will be able to reach their goal. And what National Grid has done is respond with what we are calling our fossil-free vision. And that's largely what I'm here to talk about today. Some of the things included within the draft scoping plan are here listed out. 6,000 megawatts of solar, 70% renewable energy by 2030, 100% zero emissions electric emissions by electricity. And then they also have a number of bans that we considered harmful. No new gas services to existing buildings beginning in 2024. So that also includes the development of new buildings up to and including affordable housing and facilities for nonprofits, which we are gravely concerned of particularly given reliability as it relates to what gas looks like versus electricity, and feasibility and costs relative to, things, particularly as it relates to affordable housing, has very fixed costs. And so to the extent that we're doing anything to increase those costs in context of supply chain shortages, increasing interest rates, there's really a downward pressure on those things, which also goes into, bullet 2, no new gas service for newly constructed buildings. Similarly, no new gas appliances. So if you, for instance, have a gas stove, gas water heater, things of that nature, if it were to break, and we will no longer be able to replace it with an appliance, that is similarly serviced, which again, from an affordability and feasibility perspective, is of particular concern to homeowners, because for a lot of those individuals, it would mean rewiring their homes to accommodate some of these appliances. New York, we also have an gas automobile ban after 2035. Which is National Grid is not at all opposed to. Frankly, we're not opposed to many of these things. We just have grave concerns. But as it relates to no automobile sales, we have a concern about charging. National Grid is actually the largest purveyor of electric charging infrastructure throughout the state. And to that point, we understand that there's a grave concern, particularly in the inner city and in Brooklyn, about space and where these chargers will be located, to the extent that new gas vehicles will be allowed to be sold. So this slide and this presentation will be sent to you all, so you can review and ask questions, and I will ready and able to answer them subsequent to this presentation. But these are some of the things that are in the scoping plan that we are fully aligned with. Lower emissions, expanding energy efficiency, electrification, requiring green energy for certain entities and individuals, because we understand that certain industries are greater polluters than others, and also allowing for natural gas in the electric system to be integrated from a reliability perspective, because again, to the extent that we're responsible for delivering clean, affordable, reliable energy, those pillars are extremely important to us. Here are some of the things that we are concerned about. Again, banning a gas appliance is customer choice, which is a detriment as it relates to one, choice and affordability, feasibility. Some of the other things that we're concerned about, I think if you look at bullet 3, which I think is particularly important. So the NISO is the New York State Independent Service Operators. They're responsible for ensuring that the grid of New York State is fully operational and that we are able to meet demand. They themselves are concerned and have released concerns that as early as 2023, there won't be they have reliability concerns about the ability of the grid as constructed in the draft scoping plan to meet the demands of New York, which from National Grid's perspective as the utility distributor, right? We're not in the business of, we're not in the business of drilling in offshore and hydrofracking and things of that nature. We're really in the business of distribution. And so to the extent that we're charged with ensuring that customers have reliable energy, particularly during winter months, to the extent that the NISO has pointed that out, we find that of grave concern. The second most salient point of this slide, I would say, is also the second to last bullet, where it talks about renewable energy generation. Currently, we're only producing about 26% of that energy, and so to the extent that we're required in the next 8 years to to over double that number, we think that there's a reality that is not being addressed in the sense that there's a feasibility just in terms of when these projects can get built, when permits can be approved and things of that nature. As you all know, as a community board, permitting is always a problem when you're talking about massive infrastructure projects. And so to that extent, we have a grave concern that if it's a mandate, how does that mandate meet with the realities of development, particularly in the state of New York, in the city of New York, excuse me. So again, within our comments, these are things that we highlighted, ensuring that energy is affordable, ensuring that the path to net resistance includes reliability and resilience to the extent that the draft scoping plan projects that most of the grid will be electric. If there is ever an issue with the electric grid, there is no alternative. So to the extent that we are looking at a single solution, it's a resiliency concern. To that point, there's also an equity concern to the extent that there are limited amounts of energy. Brownouts and blackouts disproportionately happen in neighborhoods of color. So if we are, again, solely relying on one form of energy and that energy source becomes unreliable and or is not of the level to meet overall demand, we already know where their shortcomings will be felt, and that is in Black and brown neighborhoods across the state and across the city. And also to that point, as it relates to where these jobs are located and the individuals who service the existing infrastructure, we understand that a lot of the green jobs certainly are well-paying jobs, and it's something that National Grid is definitely in support of, but we're also in support of our existing employees who've been doing nothing but standing and doing great work out in the community and doing what's best to keep the infrastructure safe. And so to that extent, we also have grave concerns as it relates to transitioning these workers from a workforce development perspective. Some of these slides I'll breeze through pretty fast. And again, I'll send these over, but they really go into detail about some of the specifics. So here, for instance, the issue is, the full assessment for affordability and practicality, DSP stands for the draft scoping plan. And so it's here, it says the draft scoping plan proposals aren't set out at the customer level, meaning they don't really go into detail about the true cost to customer. And to the extent that it doesn't provide that full view, we're gravely concerned with the economic impacts on these individuals and the feasibility to get it done, because to the extent that what they're proposing is unaffordable, in many ways it's unattainable. And so the last aspect of it goes into our comments relative to this issue. And then we advocate that the final plan should include these things so that customers and those of you who are in the public and aren't talking about these kinds of things every day can have a real assessment about what the plan is proposing and what the real life impact will be on communities. Same thing with customer choice. This really goes into what I spoke about earlier about gas connections and appliances, and to the extent that there isn't a full account of what does this mean from a cost perspective. Also, it doesn't contemplate the fact that some of there are appliances within, for instance, the hydrogen and or that use renewable natural gas, which are emissions-free energy sources. So to that extent, if these appliances are banned, that is both taking away an option for customers and an option for us as an energy distribution company to do and implement technologies that are used around the world. Not, these aren't foreign in the sense that they are used globally, but not foreign to the extent that they are not experimental. They're really, we're trying to bring technologies that are lauded in other places in the world to New York State, and to the extent that gas connections and bans as it relates to appliances aren't applied and aren't allowed, it becomes difficult to implement some of those things here in the state of New York. That kind of segues into this slide again about allowing new technologies and innovations to the extent that things like hydrogen and renewable natural gas aren't contemplated within a diverse suite of options. It becomes restrictive. Again, these are technologies that are being used around the world currently to meet similar goals, particularly in Europe. And so as we contemplate how we're going to reach these pathways, National Grid is advocating for a diverse approach to recognizing the goals of the CLCPA. Significant focus on energy efficiency. So one of the things that I find troubling and about the scoping plan is that in many ways, it posits the good as the enemy of the perfect. And I think this is one of those instances where we are currently states incentivizing high efficiency equipment, which is more efficient than, burning traditional oil burning and fossil fuel burning equipment. And to the extent that those subsidies are eliminated, as we transition to a full electrification or a fuller electrification environment, as we said, we're attempting to go from 26% to 70% of renewable energy within 8 years. Within that 8 years, it still contemplates that 30% of energy will be, derived from traditional sources. And we just believe that within that time, as we transition, we shouldn't do things that disincentivize people from doing things that we all agreed are beneficial. Obviously, they might not be ideal, but to the extent that, again, there's a transition, we think that, again, the good shouldn't be the enemy of the perfect. This goes into more of a technical aspect of it, of accounting of emissions. For instance, renewable natural gas, in that calculation, the draft scoping plan only contemplates the emissions component of renewable natural gas. Just for a quick refresher, RNG takes existing substances, for instance, wastewater, treatment from farms and things of that nature.
It's actually methane.
Right, indeed. So within those methane emissions, those aren't contemplated within the CAC, right? So to the extent that the use of renewable natural gas also removes methane from the atmosphere, we believe that those kind of accounting should be included within the draft scoping plan. Thank you for that clarification, Joe. Appreciate it.
But can I just point out though that I know I'm breaking my own rule, but using methane as a substitute for natural gas from methane that is going to be emitted anyway is fine. The problem is the other part of the law and the goal is to reduce methane emissions across the board. So, if the legislation is successful, there's just going to be a lot less methane to use. So,
well, certainly in theory, which is why, but unfortunately, this is not a national standard, right? So what National Grid, we're actually in the process of putting out a national RFP to acquire some of these source materials, right? Where we don't contemplate that New York State will have a sufficient amount alone to be able to meet the demand of New York, but to the extent that we are operating in the 50-state union.
Right, but one hopes that all other states are moving in the same direction. So there's going to be a lot less methane. Period. Right.
And again, in theory, right, it is as we transition, the hope is that there is more methane, right? But for instance, as you see with the infrastructure, with the IRA and with in the Build Back Better Act, right? Unfortunately, a lot of these pieces of legislation are driven by individuals who don't necessarily have the same goals in line, right? So a state like West Virginia seems to be fully entrenched in these types of practices that we've outright banned in New York. Even states as close as Pennsylvania, right, are engaged in things like hydrofracking, which again, we've banned in the state of New York. And so unfortunately, certainly I take your point. I agree, there will certainly be less methane, full stop, across the board. But to the extent that these these sources still exist, we think that it will be a benefit to the environment to use them in such a way which we're decreasing methane emissions while also ensuring that the infrastructure that is currently in people's homes is still viable going forward as we transition to a fuller electric economy.
Right. If there are far fewer homes being heated by gas.
Certainly, right, indeed.
It's
So,
not
again,
really even homes too. I think that there are just some industrial spaces.
well,
that
so,
are hard
well,
to
it depends.
electrify,
Right,
so.
it depends on where you're currently. The scoping plan contemplates it in industrial spaces, but again, to the extent that we talk about existing infrastructure, if we're not going to leverage that for purposes of people's homes, then it's a disproportionate cost on residents that isn't necessarily represented in the draft scoping plan. And what all
So what I read in the plan is it would be added as a mix to green hydrogen. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Hydrogen specifically.
Green hydrogen.
Sure. So green hydrogen is the idea that we're taking existing fuel sources, storing them in hydrogen cells from existing energy producing sources, storing them in hydrogen cells for optimal usage, and then being able to blend it and put it through the existing infrastructure. For instance, wind, solar is not a constant. These aren't energy sources that necessarily blow at the same rate to meet a demand as a place like New York City. So to that extent, if we can capture the wind when there's an oversupply in something like a hydrogen fuel cell, and then be able to reproduce that energy when it's when the demand meets, that is the concept behind green hydrogen. So again, then for purpose of it, and I think Joe, that's a very salient point. There's gray hydrogen, there's a whole black hydrogen, there's a spectrum of these things. But when we say green hydrogen, we're exclusively speaking about energy that is hydrogen that is derived from renewable energy sources. I see Mrs. Jones has a question as well.
Joan, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. I tried to raise my hand, but didn't look like it was raised. Sorry. A couple of few questions. In 2024, in an existing building, if a unit is empty and new tenant is coming in, does that mean that they will not have gas service, electric only?
So
In an existing building, it says no new gas in existing buildings as of 2024. What does that mean?
no new gas in existing building, correct. So I believe, again, the regulations have yet to be released, and as it relates to what this looks like from an implementation perspective. So I would defer to NYSERDA and the DEC and the CAC to really flesh out what that means. But I can certainly get back to you on that answer. I'm not exactly sure how that would work, to the extent that that individual is on an individual meter versus being in a meter with a number of other units. It may look different, to the extent that that individual may not be responsible. Many units, for instance, in New York City, aren't required to pay heat or hot water, and you may only pay electricity. So to the extent that you are a new tenant, it may not be and there may not be a difference as it relates to the standard, as to the extent that it would still be the meter under the landlord's name. And so there, from a state perspective, there's no change in ownership in that way. But we can certainly get back to you as it relates to individual tenants.
Well, I mean, but I don't think the state law
Thank
actually
you,
requires
Rhonda.
anyone to do anything. There is also a city law, which
Right,
has more
yeah.
teeth in it. So
Local Law 97, right? So Local Law 97 is about that's decreasing emissions for existing stock. I think what Joan was speaking to is, if you have an existing building, residential building where you have apartments, when an individual exits their apartment, they're required to close their gas meter. You have another tenant that comes in as the resident, and then what happens with that individual, correct?
Yes. Also,
she lives in a co-op building, so
no, I'm in a condominium, but that's neither here
Condominium.
nor there. That issue is not nor here nor there. Also, on the same type of issue, if I'm saying just if if this is going to be a fact where their gas is no longer available, whether it be tomorrow, 2024, or 2030. And the appliances are currently gas run. And now we're going to switch to electric. Will the 210 electric outlet be sufficient for an electric clothes dryer, stove, or heating unit? Or is the owner, whether it be a condo, a co-op, or a private house, going to have to update their electric service? I'm
I
sure
would say
that
the answer is
hasn't
no.
even been discussed.
I would say the answer is no, but however, it depends. And I would say it would depend on overall energy demand within the building. Because to your point, to the extent that you're adding new electric appliances, it becomes an increased demand on the building overall. And so to the extent that the building isn't situated from an infrastructure perspective to meet that demand, there will likely be modifications that need to be made. But as it relates specifically to the outlets and things of that nature, to the 210 outlets, I can get a specific answer for you.
And of course,
I think that
will
I think
be
that an
at
electric
the
range
price
uses less electricity than a contemporary TV. So
Well, to update your electric service, that's quite a hefty price. So all of these things should really be discussed, and public hearings should be held. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And by the way, could you send this presentation to the board, the community board, when you're done? Thanks again.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And so to that end, there's a number of, these are all different aspects of, the plan in which we think that there can be improvements made, the electrification of transports, ensuring that there's adequate infrastructure, particularly in a place like New York City, where we're already bereft of parking, to the extent that there's a need for charging infrastructure. That need becomes that much greater. To your point, Joan, this was how you could submit testimony. Previously, the actual written comments to it, to the actual hearings was done on the 1st of July. However, with that being said, they're still accepting emails. And so if there was an opportunity for you guys to reach out, I would certainly email NYSERDA directly. We also have a link here where you can find your legislature. We give this presentation to the general population. So I'm sure you all are very well aware of who your state and local legislatures are. And so calls to them, I think, would also be effective. And then for the Buffalo region, which I won't even waste you guys' time with. These are just some additional resources in which you guys can go to for information. So the Joint Utilities of New York, which is basically all of the utilities coming together just to make comments about what is going on this process and as it relates to the plan. And so I think that's a great resources for you all as well. And then this is an error, so apologies, that's the same thing. But again, the three takeaways largely from this speak to affordability and choice as it relates to going down to the customer level. And I think to your point, Joan, there's definitely a point to be made that the plan in and of itself should give enough detail so that individuals who aren't building owners, who are just regular rate-paying residents, can have some information in and around what the plan means for them. Supply as it relates to reliability, again, us as
but there's a lot of volatility in natural gas prices.
Absolutely.
So actually, electrification through renewables, there's less price volatility. So
I mean, that is not necessarily true, Joe. And I don't know if we wanted to necessarily get into a macroeconomics conversation about equity, commodity prices and demand. But I would just say that, again, as it relates to affordability, to Joan's point, for instance, if you are a homeowner.
But what does affordability mean?
for instance, if you are a homeowner and you would need to convert to a fully electric home, that is called it's estimated that cost is about $30,000 to $50,000. So that is transitioning your home from existing gas appliances to ensuring. So again, so these are estimates. These aren't necessarily
a heat pump system for a single family dwelling is not going to cost that much money.
the heat pump itself. No,
And in fact,
with
you neglect to mention that the Inflation Reduction Act includes subsidies for electrification, for heat pump systems, for electric appliances.
Certainly, but a lot of those subsidies, unfortunately, particularly in low and moderate income neighborhoods, are rebate subsidies. So unless you have the money to pay up front, it's not necessarily an opportunity for you to recoup that cost. But I see someone else has their hand up.
Should I go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Mary Jo.
Okay, this is on this affordability and choice issue, but so in a building, I mean, similar to Jones, I live in an apartment building, mine's a co-op building. We have steam heat, we have radiators, we have natural gas boiler. Does electrifying the building also require that all the the radiators have to be replaced with a different heating system? How much infrastructure change within the buildings going to be required if we have to replace the gas boiler with an electric system?
Again, that's a more technical question that I want to defer to some of our folks, but it's also very relevant to the existing infrastructure of your building. So I'm not exactly sure how your building is situated, but to the extent that it is currently, your heat, for instance, is currently distributed to a pipe network that is currently serviced through gas, I would imagine there to be pretty substantial changes that are needed to implement a fully electric system.
Well, actually, I can speak to that because I actually own a house that has a dual heat pump system. The units look like air conditioning units that are mounted on the wall. That would replace the radiator.
So the piping in the building, because ours is
Would
in
be
a big
obsolete.
building. But it doesn't have to be, it just stays there. It doesn't get, dug out of the walls.
It doesn't have to be removed.
No, but you do need to include then infrastructure that is a distribution source for each one of those individual heating units within each unit.
Mm.
So again,
Well, it's electric though.
yes, but again, it still requires.
It's not going to require the kind of invasive infrastructure that natural gas and radiator heat. And the heat pump systems will be outside of the building.
Yeah, right. Well, I agree with that. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, the reality is that infrastructure already exists. And so it wouldn't, to the extent that we would leverage that infrastructure, it wouldn't require us to do anything new. But again, so I think the second point also remains, right? Not National Grid, none of the utilities are advocating this. The NYSA, which is an independent apolitical entity, is the organization that is citing the reliability concerns, right? And so to the extent that we don't necessarily have
reliability, what do you mean by reliability?
Reliability concerns, to the extent that the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, and electricity is not as reliable as existing.
They can build storage for renewables.
Certainly, but again, how fast are they going to build the storage relative to meet the demand of New York? Again, this is not our talking point, or this is directly from the New York State Independent Service.
Well, one of the initiatives before the state is to build a pipeline from Quebec, Canada, to New York City that would be 100% renewable hydropower. That's extremely reliable.
Correct, but unfortunately, the permitting process alone would take at least a decade, and to the extent that we have to hit these goals within the next 8 years.
Well, we better start soon then.
But again, unfortunately, we have, us as National Grid, we don't have the luxury to deal in the hypothetical, right? Because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that whenever people turn their lights on or tend to turn their stove on, they have energy. And so while we can certainly hope for the best, I think I think all the points you raise are excellent and really speak to the realities of the technology. But the reality is, on the other side, is that there are forces who aren't supportive of these initiatives.
I can't use the electrical elements of my natural gas range here in the city when the power is out. So,
excuse me?
I can't use my natural gas powered range here in my New York City apartment when the power goes out. So
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
it has electrical components. Most gas ranges have electrical components.
Yes, certainly. And again, to the extent that we were putting even more demand by making them fully electric, to the extent that there's a power outage, now we have, there's no redundancy, there's no reliability in that regard. Again, these are not, I don't think that these conversations are in opposition to one another. I do think that there needs to be a consideration of the reality that this is what the people who spend a lot more time than us doing projections about what demand is relative to supply are raising as concerns.
Right. But
then,
I would point out, though, that the implementation is going to look a lot different.
Well, maybe, right. Because again, even like
right now, there are no requirements in the law whatsoever. That's what the digital scoping is about. I mean, the scoping planning sessions are about, right?
Correct, which is why, but again, I think you cited a very relevant I think example of what this looks like in real time, right? So local law 97 was implemented with much, with some of the similar onerous requirements as it relates to emissions reductions. The mayor himself, they've just released regs, but in anticipation of releasing the regs, the mayor almost stated, he would hold people to almost a good faith standard, because he understood that the challenges from an actual logistical perspective, right? Not theoretically, like really even finding enough people who can actually do the work is something that is of concern, which is why the IRA contemplates creating a civilian climate corps, right? And so this is not us, in opposition to this plan. We are National Grid is in full support of the plan. It is just from a logistical perspective, to the extent that we are required to continue to provide safe, reliable energy throughout the transition of the plan. These are the things that we are advocating that need to be addressed, regardless of how they're addressed. That's a separate conversation, but right, wrong, or indifferent, these are the things that we feel like need to be immediately addressed in the substantive way that allows individuals such as, Ms. Body and Ms. Eister, I don't know if I'm mispronouncing your name, apologies, to the extent that they have questions that directly speak to their everyday lives. The plan should contemplate that, because again, it's about the public. It's not necessarily about any of us as an individually. And then lastly, from an economic perspective, as you know, there's a number of jobs and the downward pressures on the economics, as you noted, increases in inflation, workforce shortages, supply chain issues. So to the extent that we're adding an additional cost in that regard, I think that it must be contemplated what that means from an economic development perspective, particularly as it relates to jobs and or people who are currently working in the field of providing energy. I do think that there's an opportunity, again, to the extent that we can address it in such a way that transitions individuals to the green jobs of the future. I think that would be amazing. But to the extent that the scoping plan doesn't necessarily contemplate it right now, how that happens, we think that that's something that should be addressed. So with that being said, I know you all have been asking questions throughout. I will reserve this time for anyone else to ask any questions that I may have missed.
So, Joe, there are a few questions in the Q&A. I don't see any additional hands up. Board members, please raise your hands if you have additional questions. Joe, should we throw it to attendees as well to see if they have questions?
Sure, why not?
So I know there are a few, again, in the Q&A. Members of the public, if you'd like to use the raise hand function, you could ask your question directly. Going once, going twice. Razik, if you would just look at the Q&A.
I'm looking now. Yep, it says that aren't LI. I'm not sure what, for Mrs. Kutz's question, I'm not sure what LI means. And so if she could
I believe that means lithium.
Lithium. All right, I will take that question back.
So I believe it's a different element. This would be a hydrogen cell and not a.
Correct. These are hydrogen fuel cells.
I do have one hand up though. So
then there's another question. I just want to get to Mr. Hellerman's question.
I believe he's the gentleman who's about to ask. So,
wonderful.
Mark Hellerman, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks. I don't know that I need to ask the question. I didn't even know that was an option. I think that the question is there in writing. And I'm if you can address what I said there, that would be fine.
As it
Do
relates
you
to
understand my
fracked gas.
question, Razik?
Can we move away from using fracked gas in the National Grid pipeline? How does the Northbrook Southwest pipeline and then LNG facility? So I think those are great questions. So as it relates to the pipeline of itself that was in Brooklyn, it wasn't intended to be an additional pipeline for supply. It was a redundancy pipeline. So to the extent that there's one main line that goes out, that goes throughout and brings it to our facility in Greenpoint, the idea was if something were to happen to that pipeline, whether it be upstream, whether it be in the city of New York, what National Grid contemplated was creating a alternative route for the energy to get distributed to the same location. To that, again, it was a reliability concern. National Grid was not intending to use that pipeline on a normal basis. It was
Right, but it's the fracked gas question. You said you were not in favor of fracked gas, but that's what the pipeline carries. So how does that equate?
Certainly. So to the extent that the pipeline were to carry, again, green hydrogen, you would support that. To the extent that the pipeline were to carry renewable RNG, we would support that. The way the energy system has been set up in the state of New York and really around the country is that you're not allowed to be both producer and distributor. So unfortunately, us as National Grid, we can only distribute what is sourced and what is provided in that regard. So if there were alternatives, which is why we put it in our plan, right? To the extent that there are opportunities to do things like renewable natural gas and green hydrogen, we are fully supportive of those aspects of the plan. I hope that answers the question, Sally.
Are there other questions? Or even a comment? People are free to make comments as well. So. I would point out in prepping for this presentation, looking at the electrical generation for New York State, there are two zones, downstate and upstate. And upstate New York is 88% renewable, their electricity source, from hydro and wind and also nuclear. And I don't hear anyone complaining about significant power outages.
Well, unfortunately, we were forced to offline Indian Point by state policy. And at that time, Indian Point produced upwards of 40% of New York City's carbon-free energy. And so not only are we attempting to transition per the CLCPA, we are also dealing with the recent offlining of that energy, of that clean energy. New York City isn't allowed that same luxury in that way.
That's true. That means we have to move even faster to renewable.
Absolutely, Joe. And again, Joe, I don't think what we're saying is in opposition, but I do think that the reality is for National Grid, while we're making that transition, while things are being built, while permits are being negotiated, things of that nature, we have to make sure the lights come on and we have to make sure that it's cheap enough. Because again, we are already dealing with extremely high winter heating bills that are coming up, which is something I will also provide you guys with some information on as National Grid is taking some action to try to offset that as well.
And I'm telling you now, the house that I own in Vermont, the heating bills are a lot less than they are here, and it's all electric, and it's mostly hydropower from Canada.
I would imagine the demand in New York City is extremely greater than Vermont. I love Vermont. It's a state.
No, what do you mean? It's a freestanding house that's in a much colder climate. It requires more heat.
But we're talking about an overall grid, right? So the house doesn't exist in a vacuum; it exists in a large grid. Which is, again, if that house, I would imagine, if that house was located in New York City, even if it was located in Westchester and or Long Island, I would imagine that cost structure would look materially different.
Well, I don't really get that, but I'd also point out that most people in this community are renters, so these costs are actually going to be borne by the landlord.
Which again becomes particularly preclusive. Again, as you talk about renters, those costs then get distributed.
And, yeah,
yeah.
appliances and boilers have to be replaced, right? They don't last forever. So,
Right, but again,
I don't mean to give you a hard time. I also have to tell you that in reading National Grid's report, the expanded version, I read that they are completely in favor of phasing out oil as a heating source. So, but they're not in that line of business, are they? Oil for heating?
Again, we're in the energy distribution business, right? And so whatever.
But only natural gas. What other energy sources do you distribute in New York State?
In New York State, upstate, we are both gas and electricity. And in Long Island, we currently are working on a geothermal project. We also are working on a couple of geothermal pilots per New York State regulation, which is why we would like to start doing RNG and green hydro as well.
And you're also a London-based company, correct?
Correct, which is where we produce even more electricity and green hydrogen as well. They're predominantly electric.
Well, it'd be interesting to compare what the mandates are in the UK to various states in the United States and how National Grid is responding there versus here. So.
Well, we only operate in New York and Massachusetts relative to what we do in New York State. I mean, in the United States. We have some legacy entities, but again, when it comes to our main areas of operation is New York and Massachusetts, which is, again, our fossil-free region is also contemplated within Massachusetts as well. This is something that, it's not something that we're just doing in a vacuum.
So I would say that your biggest beef, the company that you represent, is the time frame. Do you think it's?
Well, it's not time frame. It's time frame relative
the year 2030.
No, it's not. It's not time frame, right? The plan in which our fossil-free vision contemplates becoming compliant with the COCPA within the existing timeframes. The issue that we have with the methodology.
Well, how can you do that if you're still pushing for people to be able to heat and cook with natural gas?
So, I mean, local law 97 allows for that as well, right? Local law 97 gave a carve out.
For a limited amount.
Again,
I mean, it's not that severe between now and 2030, but after that, it becomes.
Again, what our issue is not the time frame. Our issue is that the plan currently does not contemplate a diverse approach to meeting the target goals. And so, to the extent that the time frame is what it is, the time frame we're dealing with urgency, right? It's a climate change crisis that we're dealing with.
So, are you saying that the state is absolutely forbidding you to use renewable natural gas and green
currently
hydrogen?
Contemplated in the draft scoping plan? Yes.
Okay. The cuts aren't as steep as people think, I'll point out, because they're over 1990 levels. And our economy was much more carbon intensive in 1990 than it is in 2022. So it's a 40% reduction over 1990 levels.
Certainly.
We've already made a lot of reductions since 1990. So,
but even that even that doesn't account. There's a reduced emissions reduction goal, but there's also a sourcing goal in the sense that X amount of percent of renewables need to come, X amount of energy needs to come from renewable sources. And to the extent
yes,
that transition,
that's a separate issue. And
right, but again, all
that is going to be an enormous challenge.
Correct. And again, to the extent we have logistical concerns as it relates to getting from point A to point B, because while we're getting from point A to point B, regardless of what pain points, lawsuits, protests, slow walking, government recessions, we still need to ensure that energy is affordable and reliable for customers. And again, one of our gravest concerns is that the plan as is does not contemplate it down to the customer level, which is what we deal with every day.
Well, I mean, National Grid is seeking a rate hike right now because of the vaporizers that they want to install in Greenpoint. So,
I mean, that's a separate issue, but again, it's not a rate.
Right.
Well, we can have the conversation now. I mean, it's more so a rate recovery relative to trying to create. I think this is a perfect example where the perfect being the enemy of the good, right? Currently, we need vaporizers to ensure that energy is available during the coldest months of the year. That's a fact. Nobody is here to dispute that. The question is, what infrastructure is used to get that energy? We at National Grid believe putting vaporizers in that are more efficient than the ones that are currently in existence is a better than using the less efficient, more emitting vaporizers that we currently operate.
Right, that might be versus having, pipelines from Pennsylvania and West Virginia running through.
Correct.
But again, you're passing the cost of that onto the consumer. So
the consumers, from all accounts, what they did not want explicitly was a pipeline, as you noted, right? And so to the extent that there is an increase in demand, we need to figure out how best to increase supply within the constraints of both feasibility and the political reality of what people do not want in their communities.
well, there's a lot to chew over here. Are there any other questions or comments? Otherwise, I think we should move on to the second presentation.
Well, I definitely appreciate you, Joe, and certainly would love to engage with you at a later date. If you guys would like us to come back and give a technical presentation about some of the things, we're welcome to do that as well. I will also give you all some answers to your specific questions, because I think that will be really helpful for you all to know how this will impact you all as residents.
I have to say that the document I read online is a lot more optimistic than the present by National Grid. Is a lot more optimistic than your presentation.
Well, our document is how we envision transitioning. Unfortunately, some of the things that we outline in our document aren't currently allowed. And so this document, the presentation is what that
is a response to that.
Correct. It's kind of basically saying, listen, to the extent that you guys aren't allowing us to use technologies such as green hydrogen and or RNG to effectuate the ultimate end goal, these are some of the things that we would like you all to consider. And again, to the extent that it doesn't go down to the customer level, these are some of the things that, given that's what we do, we think it's important for customers to know.
Okay.
I don't want to seem like a pessimist. I was working for the government while COCP was being passed. I'm very aware and a full-throated advocate of doing something about the climate crisis. But alternatively, I'm also concerned that, again, we're dealing with everyday New Yorkers, and to the extent that people aren't engaged and don't necessarily have a sense of what's coming down the pipe, no pun intended, I think that is our responsibility as people who deal with consumers every day to inform you all of what's happening. But again, I thank you all for giving me the opportunity. I definitely didn't think that we'll run this long. Apologies for keeping you all this late this evening, and look forward to the opportunity to come back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rizzi.
Take care, everyone.
Okay, now Sarah Evans will give a presentation on what's going on in Greenwood Cemetery.
Great, thank you. Oh, can I co-host?
Yes, you can. You already are co-host.
Oh, I am. All right, great. All right. This might cool things down a bit. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Evans, and I am the manager of horticulture operations and projects at Greenwood Cemetery. I'm just going to be presenting briefly on our recent tree planting project that we were able to accomplish this year, thanks to the funding from New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation, Urban and Community Forestry Grant. That is still such a mouthful. So for those on the call who may have never visited Greenwood or maybe only visit to pay respects, I quickly wanted to highlight other aspects of what Greenwood does and is. So first off, we are open to the public with free admission all year. We offer public programs that range from walking and trolley tours, guided bird walks, art installations, in-person and virtual lectures, death education, and environmental and history school programs. Greenwood was designated a National Historic Landmark by the U.S. Department of the Interior in 2006. And our collection of trees was accredited by ArbNet, which is Morton Arboretum's Arboretum accreditation program. We attained a level 3 accreditation. There are different tiers to the accreditation because of our diversity of species and cultivars in the collection. We make the data of our collection available to the public. I'll touch on that at the end of the presentation. We conduct and we collaborate on scientific research that relates to the urban forest. And we also have environmental education programs. We actually just welcomed our manager of environmental education this year. So the tree planting project is in support of Greenwood's Arboretum Management Plan, which I believe the Director of Horticulture, Joe Chera, presented on back in 2019. So this management plan was written by Davy Resource Group. It was also funded by the Urban and Community Forestry Grant of the DEC. And in conjunction with Greenwood's tree inventory that was taken back in 2016, the plan outlined the need to replace trees that have been lost or trees that have been identified for removal. The goals are twofold in the planting project. So first is to maintain Greenwood's overall tree count, and at the time it was a little over 7,000 trees. And second is to sustain Greenwood's canopy cover. The recommended level was 35%. So I'm sure you can tell if we're removing a lot of trees, we actually need to be planting way more to keep that canopy cover at 35%. So we now, after this planting project, have exceeded 8,000 trees. So the obvious daunting takeaway from the management plan was the aggressive tree planting that was required by Greenwood and has to continue so that we can provide shade and habitat in the future for future generations. And we would not be able to do this again without the generous funding from New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation. All right, so this past spring, the trees were planted. We planted 270. All these little green dots represent all the trees that went into the ground. And we were able to plant 270 and maximize the funding of the grant because we chose to plant bare root trees. The species that were selected because there's good information on them that they will be able to adapt to Brooklyn's changing climate in the future. So they're adapted to higher winter temperatures and they have good tolerance of drought, which is really important. I'm going to be speaking about water later. All right, so why bare root trees? So bare root trees are not just economical, like I just said, but they have many other advantages to trees that are purchased from nurseries, usually in the ball and burlap. So according to research conducted by Cornell University, bare root trees contain 200% more roots than a tree dug with soil intact and wrapped in a burlap. This is because the majority of the roots of the tree actually grow horizontally beyond the extent of the tree's canopy, rather than sort of like this. It's almost like an artistically derived idea that the roots mirror the canopy below. It is also more energy efficient to plant bare root. So the lack of soil makes these trees very light. So we don't need to use heavy equipment to transport and plant the trees. They are carried by hand and the holes are dug by shovel. But one of the challenges of bare root tree planting is they're vulnerable to root desiccation. So there's a bit of a time crunch in transporting trees from the nursery and getting them into the ground. So to combat this, the tree roots were dipped in a slurry of hydrogel and immediately bagged. Hydrogels are little polymers that can hold several hundred times their weight in water. And then we also stored the trees in our catacombs. If you've ever been on one of Greenwood's night tours or attended a concert in the catacombs, you would be familiar with how chilly it is in there. So these vaults are underground and the temperature remains about 55 degrees inside. And they're shady. So it's a perfect place to store trees while they wait to be planted. And we can only do this with material like bare root trees. So once the trees are in the ground, maintaining their access to water is very important. On the screen now are just a little grove of maples that were planted in spring. And Greenwood has a big challenge with this. Being 478 acres and 184 years old, our irrigation infrastructure is not as adequate to be able to deliver water throughout the entire cemetery. So each tree is manually watered with 5 to 10 gallons of water at least every 2 weeks. More was needed this summer. And then we also concentrated the planting to be in across smaller areas, allowing for the trees to be more efficiently watered because it just cuts down on travel time for the person doing the watering. And in addition to the trees being mulched, we also install what is trademarked as a tree diaper. You can actually buy ones that are made of recycled diapers upon request. It's a donut-shaped mat that has porous material sewn together, and inside is another super absorbent polymer. So it has the ability to collect and store rainwater and supplemental water, and then slowly release it into the soil through osmosis as needed. It also inhibits moisture from evaporating from the soil and protects the roots, keeps them nice and cool. So both of these strategies, sort of the design of the planting and the use of the tree diapers, has really helped ensure the establishment of the trees. Even during this summer when we experienced a serious drought, all of the trees have survived. And with the grant, we were also able to do outreach, some of my favorite. We held a volunteer tree planting event on Arbor Day where attendees learned how to properly plant tree and planted many trees. And we were also joined by Big Reuse, where they educated the volunteers about compost and soil tree health, and they also held a tree and compost giveaway. On the left is our manager of development holding her takeaways. And speaking of compost, what you see before you is real wood chips that came from Greenwood. We are constantly producing wood chips just through all of our tree maintenance practices. And we do deliver a lot of the wood chips to compost facilities like Big Reuse, but we also have them available for you. So if you have a community garden, a school that needs wood chips for your garden, please come, bring bags. You can collect as much as you want. There seems to be an endless supply. And if you do require a huge amount of wood chips, 20 plus yards, you can always reach out to the horticulture department via email, and we can begin discussing how we can help deliver the wood chips to you. And last but not least, I wanted to mention that if you are curious tonight, or have questions, if you ever visit and look at our trees, we do have our tree finder. It's available at green-wood.com/trees, and it is an up-to-date digital map of all the trees that are currently alive at Greenwood. And there are many features. You can filter by genus by using this little like flashlight guy. Or if you're out in the field and you see one of the accession tag numbers on the tree, you can always enter it right here. And with that, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
I see Meryl's hand up. Or Mary, I'm sorry.
That's all right. Yeah, I have a question about how to what extent is your tree planting focusing, or all of your planting really focusing on native species? Because I know Greenwood has, I confess I'm a birder. I spend a lot of my waking hours in Greenwood. I know there are lots of really beautiful, but not native trees all over the cemetery. And I think, I might be wrong about this, that natives are potentially more sustainable.
Yes, assumption is correct. And they also support like way more species of insects,
Right.
mammals, fungi, bacteria. So
Sure.
that's a great question. So back in about, I would say like about 40% of our collection back in 2018 was native. And over the past 4 years, like in all of our tree planting efforts, we honestly try to do like a majority 80% native in the volume that we're planting, and 20% cultivars of natives or, non-natives. But yes, we are definitely trying to like tip that scale. Yeah. Native plants are at the forefront of our mind on our projects.
Can I ask a follow-up question? This might be beyond
For
the
sure.
scope, though. Because I don't know if it's about trees, but I know that there's been a project that I keep hearing about in the Del Water, about ridding the Del Water of the overwhelming invasives and replanting it with natives. Where does that stand?
That stands still in the design and planning stage.
There are a lot of Norway maples there, and you've
That's
removed them
right.
from other parts of the cemetery. So
That is right. Yeah. I did a survey of the understory of that woodlot maybe 2 years ago, and there are a lot of native understory. There's like black oak, red oak, various hickories. But
really,
yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. But we have a lot of different woodlots that woodlots are kind of a beast in terms of, managing, because most of our woodlots are growing on steep slopes. So we always have to take into consideration soil erosion, and also just the tendency that when you do a really vast clear cutting, it just immediately invites a ton of just like invasive plants that then require a lot of herbicides, which we are really trying to reduce
Good.
the use of. So
yeah, because you did that near the slope near Sylvan Water, right? You cut
yes,
down all the Norway maples there,
yes.
and then you had to rebuild the path, right? The
Yes,
upper path.
that's right. Yeah. There was a huge refurbishing project over there.
I actually have two questions about pathogens and invasive species.
Sure.
A few years ago, there was oak wilt found in the cemetery. Can you tell us if there's been a recurrence or?
Yeah, so that instance of oak wilt still remains somewhat unsolved and a bit of a mystery. So we have a plant health program, being helped with Davy, resource tree experts. And so we are monitoring all of our oak trees that are exhibiting symptoms of oak wilt and bacterial leaf scorch, and samples are constantly being sent to the lab. And we haven't found any positive instances of it since. It's most of our oaks that you see, the large mature red oaks that you see that look like they're in severe decline, they are tested for bacterial leaf scorch, but that doesn't seem to be their only issue. It just seems like they're just like experiencing decline overall.
So a natural lifespan decline?
Possibly. Yeah, we do treat them with like fertilizer injections for the ones that are recommended to do so. And we do retrenchment pruning to kind of not only stabilize the structure of the trees, but also just like encourage that natural process of retrenchment where they will resprout. And we have been seeing some positive effects on some of the trees. So, yeah.
My second question is about emerald ash borer.
Mm-hmm.
Has it been detected in Greenwood or Brooklyn yet?
I believe so. Yes.
Really? What
Yes.
about in the cemetery?
Not in the cemetery, but I think EAB is definitely in the city.
Is there a plan to treat trees that become infested, or you just assume that it may not be a viable tree in this area anyway with climate change, but
yeah, no, we do proactively treat the large mature ash trees that we have.
good.
Yeah.
Were many trees lost to the drought? I mean, I know you said that the new trees were all saved, but what about mature trees?
We actually have seen a lot of decline and a few losses from the drought. Interestingly, though, it seems to be affecting mostly our lindens. But yeah, no, a lot of just, trees and shrubs that have been long established just did not do well during the summer. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments?
I have one other question, and I wasn't going to get to my hand up fast enough. You said that your irrigation system is inadequate for the needs and the hand watering and everything. Is there anything happening to change that, to enhance it?
Oh, yeah, I must have misspoke. It's inadequate in that it is infrastructure that we don't have. So a lot of gardens, have in-ground irrigation.
Yep.
And that would just be untenable for us. Like,
Sure.
yeah. We're too large of a space. We are constantly digging in the ground. So, we're not upset. We actually don't ever want to like overuse an abundant of potable water because that is the water source, it's the municipal water source that we're watering trees with right now. But the stormwater project might help mitigate some of that coming soon. No, hand watering is good. And honestly, another perk of, just having humans water the trees is that we have constant eyes on our trees. So they are always communicating with us when something might be awry with some of the trees. So, yeah.
Well, I also read, because when I thought it was going to be about the DEC grant to build rain gardens, that it would be collecting excess runoff that could then be used to actually water Greenwood. So
that's in part of the plan. Yeah.
Any
All
other
right.
questions?
I do have a question, but I see someone asked like what the link to the tree ID is, but I don't know how to type it in to the chat. I don't see an option to do that.
So,
I see type answer. All
okay,
right.
and Joan
It's late.
Body has her hand up as well.
Okay, Joan, go ahead.
Hi, Sarah. Sarah, I'm just wondering, you guys have a well, don't you? I understand that a well was,
We do have a well, yeah.
could you tell me where about is that well?
It is over by our historic chapel.
And what street is that would that be?
What avenue would that be? Oh, geez.
Okay.
Right.
Where,
Isn't that landscape?
yes. Yeah, so it's very
Is that-
close to the Gothic arch.
Is that quite helpful for your watering, or don't you use that for watering?
We tap into it occasionally, but I don't think much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other hands? Please use the raise hand function, folks. Joe, could I open it to attendees? Oh,
Yes, of course.
well, Mary Eister has her hand up as well. So Mary?
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought we were about to end. This isn't really a question, it's a comment. I just want to say that for people who haven't been there, the plantings, particularly around the historic chapel, the wildflowers that go up the hillsides and over, it's absolutely fantastic, particularly this time of the year. I think
yes.
that, the cemetery is to be commended. It is so beautiful.
Mary, did you know we're actually expanding that, wildlife meadow planting across from Valley Water?
Yeah, I did, because
All right.
that's in honor of.
You had a
good
hand in that,
friend of
Mary,
mine.
didn't you? The birdathon, you raised money for that?
Yeah, because it's in honor of Janet Schumacher,
Yes.
a good friend. But yeah, it's beautiful. It's just
Yeah.
fantastic.
I know the goldenrods and the asters are just like in all their glory right now. Yeah.
Members of the public, please feel free to raise your hand. I'm sorry, Joe.
There was also a project with Cornell in order to restore native grasslands. Will that continue?
So what has come of that is we've actually hired a landscape manager. Her name is Nancy Fioratini, and she joined in June. So yeah, she's already kickstarted a lot of various projects in essentially restoring much of our lawn and turf and shifting the species composition.
Any other
Anyone
questions?
else?
I'm seeing no additional hands.
I have one comment. What was up with all the the skunks in the cemetery this summer.
You tell me, I don't know. They have really boomed. I don't know. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
I guess that's the end. Take care, everyone.
Good night.